The day my father fired me felt like having the ground wrenched from beneath my feet. One second, I was riding the high of our company's miraculous turnaround. A turnaround I'd spearheaded by coding a travel app that brought us from the brink of bankruptcy to a staggering $400 million in profit. The next second, I was jobless, staring at the brutal finality on his face. I can still feel the sting in my chest, that raw mixture of betrayal and heartbreak. My father never wanted to believe in my ideas. But I never imagined he would go so far as to erase me from the very success I had created. I grew up immersed in the family business. My earliest memory is of running around the old Silvercrest travel office, back when it was a modest operation with outdated computers and messy desks crammed into an ancient building downtown. My father, the legendary Martin Hayes, was convinced that interpersonal relationships were the cornerstone of any thriving travel agency. He never fully embraced technology, always preferring handwritten notes, personal phone calls, and thick catalogs that showcased vacation destinations in glossy, dreamlike photos. At its height, before digital disruption, Silvercrest Travel was a mid-sized powerhouse. We specialized in designing custom vacations for busy executives and well-off families who craved the personal touch Dad was so proud of. But times changed quickly. By my late teens, I was noticing a massive shift in how people were booking trips. Online aggregators sprouted up like weeds, offering flights, hotels, and entire vacation packages through slick, user-friendly apps. As a result, Silvercrest Travel began bleeding revenue. Our overhead was too high, our offerings too limited, and our technology nearly non-existent. My father, stubborn and set in his ways, tried to fix it by doubling down on the same strategies that had once made him successful, pushing his aging travel agents to call more people, to refine their pitch, to create premium print brochures. None of it worked. I went to college and majored in computer science. While my father insisted I focus on real-world business tactics to prepare for an eventual takeover, I found myself magnetically drawn to coding, app development, and data analytics. It fascinated me how a few lines of code could connect people to a world of possibilities, whether it was booking flights or sharing photos across continents. And in the back of my mind, I always thought I might use these skills to save Dad's floundering company. If only he'd let me. When I graduated, I returned to Silvercrest Travel, expecting a warm welcome, maybe even an open-minded invitation to share fresh ideas. What I got was a rusted desk in a windowless cubicle, away from the main offices, and a vague directive to help out wherever needed. If I tried to speak about modernizing the company, Dad shut me down with a dismissive wave, telling me I hadn't earned the right to propose changes yet. I built this company from scratch, he liked to remind me. I know what I'm doing. Meanwhile, the company's finances continued to nosedive. By the time I'd spent a year in that cubicle, we were teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. The staff was reduced to half its original size. Morale was at rock bottom. I kept hearing rumors of potential buyouts or forced shutdowns. Every day it felt like we were drowning in quicksand, with Dad still convinced that a phone call and a handshake were more powerful than any app or algorithm. I was frustrated but not ready to give up. Late into the evenings, after the cleaning staff left and only the glow of fluorescent lights remained, I worked on a pet project. A digital travel platform that could integrate flight bookings, hotel reservations, and curated vacation experiences in one streamlined place. I started with basic code to see if I could piece together existing APIs for airlines, hotels, and car rentals. The initial results were messy, but the potential was enormous. During the day, I tried again and again to gently show Dad prototypes of what I was building. He wouldn't even glance at my laptop screen. "We don't need more distractions," he'd say. "If you want to help, pick up the phone and try selling a vacation to somebody." He was so confident that personal relationships and cold calling would be enough to save us. But call after call failed to yield any real results. My mother, far more open-minded, encouraged me not to stop. She'd quietly remind me that once Dad's back was truly against the wall, he might see reason. "Be patient," she'd say. "Your father can't ignore success if you put it right in front of him." And so I pressed on. I refined the code, tested different user interfaces, and started imagining how we could brand it as a Silvercrest Travel exclusive. Over time, I even recruited a few reluctant coworkers who were younger and more tech-savvy. Together, we built out a rough version of the travel app. We called it Silvergate. The tipping point came one chilly January morning. Our CFO, an exhausted-looking woman named Adrienne, convened a meeting with Dad and the remaining department heads. I wasn't invited, but I heard the fallout from behind the glass wall. Adrienne warned that if we didn't pivot drastically, we'd be bankrupt within 6 months. A hush fell over the office. Dad tried to argue that new sales initiatives would soon pay off, but you could see the desperation in his eyes. He was running out of excuses. Later that evening, I summoned the courage to ask for an appointment with him. He was about to leave the office, coat slung over one arm, eyes shadowed with stress. "Dad, please, I need just 15 minutes, I said, blocking the doorway. There was a pause, a flicker of something in his expression, maybe resignation. Finally he nodded. "Fine, but make it quick." I walked him back into the conference room and fired up a large monitor. My heart pounded as I explained how Silvergate worked. You could download the app, input your travel preferences, and in seconds get flight options, hotels, recommended activities, all at negotiated Silvercrest travel rates. The user could also chat with a live consultant, one of our staff members, if they wanted a personal touch. My father's eyebrows furrowed at the concept, but he stayed silent. When I showed him how swiftly the platform recalculated an itinerary if a flight was delayed or canceled, I saw the faintest glimmer of interest in his eyes. At the end of the demonstration, I braced myself for another dismissive remark. Instead, Dad let out a long breath. "We're out of time," he said, his voice shaky. "I can't afford to ignore any idea that might keep this company alive." That was as close to an endorsement as I was ever going to get, and I seized it. We announced a trial run of the Silvergate app 2 weeks later. Just a small pilot with a handful of loyal customers who still booked vacations through us. The pilot was a success beyond anything I'd hoped for. The test group loved how intuitive it was to compare flights and how quickly they could book entire vacation packages in one go. We built a promotional campaign around the notion that a real human agent was still behind the scenes if you needed help. The mixture of high-tech convenience and old-fashioned support seemed to strike a chord. Word of mouth spread, and soon we had more customers requesting access than we'd prepared for. Dad's mood shifted from sullen pessimism to cautious hope. He started calling me into strategy meetings with department heads, letting me share the performance metrics. Within 3 months, our app-based bookings overshadowed phone-based bookings for the first time in Silvercrest's history. Revenue climbed sharply, enough to begin pulling us out of a financial freefall. The staff that remained felt a spark of optimism, and we even hired back a few laid-off workers to manage the app's new demands. To my astonishment, Dad publicly acknowledged my contribution at the next company town hall. "My son here has introduced a new chapter in Silvercrest Travel's story," he proclaimed, shaking my hand in front of everyone. I nearly teared up. It was the moment I'd dreamed of, Dad finally seeing me as someone capable, someone worthy of shaping the company's future. But behind that praise, I noticed shadows of tension in him, almost as if admitting my achievement also stoked some deeper insecurity. He was always a proud man, revered as the founder and face of Silvercrest. Maybe, in my excitement, I underestimated how threatened he might feel. In those early days, though, all I could see were the skyrocketing sales figures and the euphoria of pulling the company back from the brink. Our biggest triumph came about 6 months after Silvergate's pilot launch, when we brokered a massive partnership with 3 major airlines and a chain of luxury resorts. Suddenly, we had exclusive deals that no other third-party booking site could offer. We tied these promotions into the app and the numbers exploded. In a shocking reversal of fate, Silvercrest went from near insolvency to turning a healthy profit. We kept scaling, forging partnerships with hotels worldwide, adding last-minute deals, and refining our user interface to be more interactive. By the end of that first full year, the accountants tallied our total profit at a mind-blowing $400 million, an all-time record for Silvercrest. The news made headlines in local business journals, applauding the Hayes family's tech-savvy pivot. Dad, smiling widely in photo ops, explained that we'd modernized and found a perfect blend of digital convenience and personal service. He liked to claim it was years of expertise meeting new technology. He'd always give me a public nod, but over time, I noticed he never mentioned my name quite as much as he mentioned his own brand and legacy. One day, a major tech publication requested an interview with me specifically, calling me the architect behind Silvercrest's improbable comeback. I was flattered, but Dad intervened. "We need a consistent voice," he said. "I'll handle that interview." At the time, I shrugged and agreed. After all, he was the CEO and the face of Silvercrest. I was just thrilled to see my ideas recognized, even if my father was the one doing most of the talking. But each time a media opportunity arose, Dad insisted on controlling the narrative. He began to sign contracts and forging new alliances without my input. He repeatedly told me, "I've got decades of experience, son. I know how to handle these negotiations." When I tried to bring up expansions or app updates we needed to remain ahead of the curve, he'd nod but rarely follow through. Meanwhile, A creeping sense of unease told me that Dad was taking my success and labeling it as his own. It felt petty to dwell on it, so I tried to ignore that whisper in my head. We were saving the company after all. Wasn't that the goal? Just as we settled into a stable phase, a new challenge arose: maintaining our competitive edge. Rivals in the travel tech industry began launching similar features. Some big players sought to replicate our success with their own curated experiences. I worked tirelessly with my small tech team, brainstorming improvements and expansions, like dynamic pricing, better data analytics for flight disruptions, and an optional membership program that could yield recurring revenue streams. I pitched these ideas at executive meetings, pushing for continuous innovation so we wouldn't become complacent. Dad resisted, claiming we needed to slow down and enjoy the profits. He wouldn't allocate the budgets required for these expansions, nor would he let me hire more developers. Over lunch one day, I confronted him about it, asking why he was shutting down proposals that could keep us on top. He deflected, saying something about how we shouldn't risk the company's newfound stability on unproven gimmicks. That same night, I discovered an unsettling truth. One of the new developers confided in me that Dad had started meeting behind closed doors with certain investors who wanted to see Silvercrest Travel pivot back toward a more traditional brand identity, focusing on upscale clientele through offline relationships. These investors were old acquaintances of Dad's, apparently enticed by the sweet smell of our $400 million profit. They believed they could replicate the app's success without further digital reinvestment, like milking a cash cow without feeding it. I was incensed. Could Dad really be so short-sighted? Our resurgence was entirely tied to the app's capabilities, not dusty old marketing strategies. But I kept calm, deciding to gather data and put forth a compelling case at the next board meeting, something so airtight that no investor could ignore it. I wanted to demonstrate how further innovation was not just a bonus, but a necessity to remain relevant in an ever-evolving digital world. A week before that board meeting, Dad called me into his office. The blinds were drawn, and there was a stack of papers on his desk. His expression looked grave. My stomach twisted with a sense of foreboding. "Close the door," he said, his tone cold. I did as told, and we stood there facing each other, father and son, but also boss and employee. He began by thanking me for my work on the app. "You've done extraordinary things," he acknowledged quietly, "and nobody can take that away from you." Relief washed over me for a split second. Maybe he was going to see reason and let me lead the next wave of expansion. Then came the hammer blow, but effective immediately: "I'm eliminating your position. You're no longer employed at Silvercrest." I stood rooted to the spot, mind reeling. "What are you talking about?" I stammered. "I practically built the entire digital wing of Silvercrest." He averted his gaze, fiddling with a pen. "We're restructuring," he said almost mechanically. "We have new investors who want to streamline operations. Your department is going to be folded into the broader marketing arm. And they don't think we need a separate VP for digital." I told him that was insane, that the entire reason Silvercrest was still breathing was because of the app. He shrugged. "We'll retain the basic platform, of course. But the board and I have decided we don't want to commit to more expansions right now. Too risky. The app is stable, so we'll maintain it. But we don't need your role going forward." My heart was pounding in my ears. "Dad, how can you do this?" I asked, voice shaking with a cocktail of anger and grief. "I've given everything to make sure this company wouldn't die. Now you're telling me I'm done?" His face hardened. "That's the decision. You'll get a severance package and you'll keep your shares. But you'll step aside." I stormed out in disbelief, tears stinging my eyes. All the humiliations and rejections in my life had never hurt like this. Betrayal by the man whose approval I'd always sought, whose legacy I was trying to protect. It was gut-wrenching. I spent the rest of the day packing up my office in stunned silence, fielding questions from confused coworkers who asked if I'd been promoted or something. I had to mumble that I was leaving the company, not trusting myself to speak the truth about the father who had just fired me. Hours later, I carried a single cardboard box out the front doors of Silvercrest Travel, feeling as though I'd stepped into a surreal nightmare. The staff parted like the Red Sea, too shocked to speak. My father didn't even appear to say goodbye. I left without a final handshake, without a hug, without any closure. In the weeks that followed, I descended into a strange mixture of fury, despair, and numbness. My mother called daily, her voice trembling with concern, but I brushed her off. I couldn't talk to either of my parents. I found out from an acquaintance inside the company that Dad had quickly replaced my department with a skeleton crew of marketing personnel who only planned to maintain the app's current version, ignoring all the new features I'd been working on. They were milking the golden goose without feeding it any new seeds. The media, still high on the story of Silvercrest's turnaround, started sniffing around. Where was I, the so-called tech genius who'd rescued the business? Dad released a carefully crafted statement that I had decided to pursue new opportunities and that Silvercrest was refining its structure. Why's all of it? I simmered with resentment, but at the same time I felt an odd clarity. I still had my skills, my vision, and my ambition. He could hold onto the shell of Silvercrest, but the heart of its digital innovation was mine. My phone buzzed nonstop with calls and texts from recruiters, rival travel agencies, and even venture capitalists who'd smelled blood in the water. They sensed that if I could create a blockbuster travel app once, maybe I could do it again, this time for a competitor or in my own startup. Initially, I ignored them, wanting nothing more than to crawl under a blanket and forget the world existed. But my anger soon morphed into determination. Why let my father's betrayal define my future? Eventually, I accepted an invitation from a large hospitality conglomerate that had admired Silvercrest's success. Over coffee in a sleek downtown cafe, they pitched me the idea of a brand new platform that would integrate lodging, experiences, and real-time dynamic pricing. They offered me creative control and a blank check. It was flattering, but I also wanted to be sure that I'd not be repeating the same mistakes, handing my innovation to someone who might discard me when it suited them. So I explored further. Another option was starting my own tech venture. A few of my loyal former colleagues were game to join me, having grown disillusioned at how Dad had gutted the digital department. I weighed the pros and cons, eventually deciding that building something from scratch, on my own terms, was the path that appealed most to me. With the severance money and my own savings, I had enough runway to assemble a small team and test out a new travel tech concept. I could design it from the ground up without the constraints of an existing company's old-fashioned methods. In a twist of irony, one day after I filed the paperwork to incorporate my new startup, I received a direct message from Dad. It was short: "I trust you're settling into your new endeavors. No hard feelings, I did what was best for Silvercrest. Good luck out there." My gut churned with anger but also sadness. This man who taught me to ride a bike, who cheered at my little league games, who'd once been my hero, couldn't see the damage he'd inflicted on our relationship. Or maybe he could and didn't care enough to mend it. Either way, I didn't respond. I blocked his number and pressed forward. Building a startup from scratch proved both exhilarating and terrifying. I rented a small loft downtown where my new team, 5 dedicated coders and designers plus me, set up shop. We spent countless nights brainstorming, coding, throwing out prototypes and starting over. We aimed to push beyond what I'd done at Silvercrest, integrating real-time analytics, predictive modeling for flight disruptions, and even specialized features for niche travelers, like adventure tourists and eco-conscious explorers. The deeper we went, the more I realized how badly I'd wanted to do this at Silvercrest, if only Dad hadn't stifled me. A year later, our platform, unofficially dubbed Wanderwave, was nearly ready for beta testing. During that time, I occasionally glimpsed headlines about Silvercrest travel. Their profits had plateaued, and there were murmurs that they'd begun to lose the momentum the app initially generated. While part of me felt a surge of vindication, another part felt a pang of regret. I never wanted to destroy Dad's company, I wanted to save it. We'd soared to $400 million in profit together. If only he could have embraced the next stage of innovation. Just as we geared up for our beta launch, a rumor reached me. Silvercrest was experiencing internal strife, with Dad clashing against the board. The investors he'd courted had demanded immediate payoffs, meaning they wanted the company to slash budgets even further. People started to say that Dad was losing his grip, that perhaps a buyout loomed in the near future. Some ex-colleagues confided that morale was once again in the gutter, with no new digital features to keep them competitive. The father I'd once idolized was letting the company stagnate, all because he feared losing control. I'd be lying if I said I felt no schadenfreude. But more than anything, I felt sadness for the employees left behind. I recalled the elation they experienced when we first turned the corner, the renewed sense of hope that came from seeing a forward-thinking approach actually bear fruit. Now they were dealing with layoffs again, empty promises, a rerun of the same old paternalistic style. It made me realize that success in business, and in life, relies on a willingness to adapt, to evolve, and to share credit where it's due. When our startup's beta finally went public, the initial response was electric. Early adopters loved how they could tailor an entire vacation, flights, lodging, local tours, and even travel insurance, through a single streamlined dashboard. Our real-time analytics engine saved them money by predicting off-peak moments for booking. Influencers raved about the user experience on social media, which was better than any marketing campaign. Though we were a small team, we felt unstoppable. And I carried a sense of fulfillment that I'd rarely tasted at Silvercrest. This was my creation, free from paternal oversight or corporate politics. As for Dad, I heard through the grapevine that he'd stepped down as CEO after caving to pressure from the board. They brought in an external executive to try to salvage the remains of Silvercrest. No press release ever mentioned me or the original app that had saved them from bankruptcy. It was as though that chapter had been quietly erased. I'd be lying if I said it didn't still hurt. But I also recognized that I'd transcended that pain by forging a path on my own. Now, with our platform scaling, investors knocking on the door, and travel industry insiders hailing us as the next big disruptor, I occasionally allow myself a moment to reflect on everything that happened. I remember the day Dad fired me, how I felt the floor drop from under my feet. I remember the humiliating feeling of carrying a cardboard box out the doors of the company I'd saved. But I also remember the flash of clarity that came once the worst happened. I was free to build something new. As much as it stings to say, maybe Dad inadvertently did me a favor by letting me go. I haven't spoken to him in over a year. My mother tries to broker peace, but neither of us is ready. Sometimes I imagine reconciling, maybe decades down the line, when all this is a distant memory. But I don't know if he'll ever acknowledge the wrongness of his actions. There are still nights when I wake up, heart pounding, reliving that conversation. We don't need your role going forward. The cruelty of that line echoes in my mind, a reminder that pride can overshadow even a father's love. All I can do now is push forward, grateful for the lessons learned, harsh though they were. I discovered that the best ideas can flourish in the unlikeliest conditions, and that no matter how desperately you crave someone's approval, the truest satisfaction comes from recognizing your own worth. I learned that real leadership isn't about hoarding power, but about lifting others and embracing the future rather than clinging to the past. If our new venture continues on its current trajectory, we could easily surpass the success I helped create at Silvercrest. And perhaps one day I'll see a newspaper article about my father, retired, living quietly, still telling stories of his early days in the travel industry. Part of me wonders if he'll ever let himself feel proud of what I've become, or if he'll remain too consumed by the notion that I overshadowed him. Either way, I'm done chasing his validation. I have my own team now, my own dream, and a thriving business that's rewriting how people travel. That alone is worth more than the fleeting recognition I once sought from him. It's ironic that the man who told me to wait my turn, to step aside, inadvertently handed me the key to forging my own destiny. So yes, I built a travel app that salvaged our bankrupt company and skyrocketed it to $400 million in profit, only to be fired by my own father. It still reads like a cautionary tale. But I also see it as the pivotal turning point that set me free. Instead of staying locked in a cycle of outdated thinking, I had to stand on my own 2 feet and innovate without compromise. In the end, I found more fulfillment, creativity, and integrity in this new chapter than I ever would have under his shadow. Some nights, I step onto my balcony and watch planes cross the sky. I smile, remembering the chaos of Silvercrest's old office and the exhilarating moment our first pilot app took flight. I let myself feel a small pang of nostalgia for what might have been, if Dad and I had been able to collaborate as equals. But that moment passes, replaced by gratitude for the path I'm on now. Life has a way of pushing us in directions we never anticipated. The journey may be painful, but often it's exactly the push we need to discover our true potential.